remarkable when you have an $87 million funding envelope, how many people want to be your friends? I don't make any of those decisions. I simply work with people who make those decisions. Quickly, the so what question once again. We get asked this for all kinds of pieces of research. When we're in our discussions tomorrow and we're talking about labor markets, labor market attachment, labor market performance, labor market outcomes, foreign credential recognition, everybody uses those as broad motherhood statements. We can all agree that they're important and there is a need. Where we start to find the challenge is how do you find the digestible chunks? Where do you identify a core population that's in need with a very specific issue for which you can come up with a programmatic answer to try out to see if it works? So when you look at that kind of data, what you're looking for is something that is manageable, that is defined, that has clear outcomes. Because this is one of our big challenges is when we look at a broad swath of programming like labor market outcomes, what that encourages people to do is go to StatsCan, look at the census, look at all those who are foreign born, and then look at their outcomes in comparison to the Canadian born. We're never going to win that game. So we need to be in a world where our programming has very clearly defined outcomes for specific populations so that we know whether or not we have achieved that for that population. Because if we use the aggregate number, there simply is not enough money for us to move those yardsticks to the extent that we need to do so. To build the case, you pilot the initiatives. You heard Natasha talk about it earlier today. Big ones, small ones, tightly defined outcomes, and then we can look at scaling those up once we can prove that the programming works. Because that is the universe that we find ourselves in. Where is the evidence is a question that we get asked all of the time when we're looking for funding for settlement programs. We have about 20 minutes for you to ask our panel specific questions, general questions, and we'll do a little bit of housekeeping so that you know what your homework is for tonight. I remind you, the big long reports and the PowerPoints are on the website, so if you didn't get numbers, don't worry, they'll be available to you. So with that, can we throw the floor open to people for questions?
Bonjour, ma question va être adressée à tous les panélistes en français. Je vous remercie d'abord pour votre présentation, mais à travers toutes vos présentations, je n'ai pas senti la problématique de l'alphabétisation des immigrants qui nous arrivent, qui étaient des passages peut-être dans les camps des réfugiés et qui nous arrivent ici. Connaissance des langues, ni en français zéro, ni en anglais zéro. Qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire avec ces gens-là au niveau de l'alphabétisation? Merci.
Thank you for that question. I didn't have time today to share with you the research that we've been doing with these 5 data sets with regards to the effect of not being fluent in English or French on labor market outcomes, on service use, on feeling your sense of belonging. I can say that there are some language issues, so if you are not fluent in English, your ability to get a job that's matching your skill set is significantly less. If you are not fluent in one of the official languages, particularly if you're living in a rural area in Western Canada, you are significantly less likely to feel like you have a sense of belonging, and you're also less likely to access services as well. So we are looking at those issues. I just didn't have enough time to share them with you.
Sure. We have a report that will be up on our website soon looking at language ability and outcomes, and it includes French only, English only, both, and neither official language, and it looks at a number of different outcomes, so that should be up within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Oh, well, let's go to the back first, and then we'll come back to this side of the room.
Yeah, 2 things. Buck Buchanan, City Councillor from Red Deer, and when you were talking there, you were talking about urbans and rurals, and I'm just, maybe you were confusing Martin and myself here, but anything outside of Edmonton and Calgary is considered rural in Alberta. So are we all on the same page here? That's my first question. And the second question is on the research recently with the, as Rachel said, that little immigration thing I was at in Calgary with Nick Narani. He said that 1 in 5 immigrants is returning home. So in your research projects, is there anything like on the exit to find out what the primary cause of this is? Because if you spend $50,000 to get here, there's got to be some reason that you're going home. So those are my 2 questions.
So Vicky, you want to go first this time?
Sure. Tracking people who've left the country is really difficult, right? Getting people, unless there's a systematic way of getting them before they go, we have difficulty tracking those people. We do ask people if they were to leave, what would be the reasons for them leaving in things like the Alberta survey and some of the other surveys. So we do ask people what their motivation for leaving might be, but we don't then track people who have left.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to answer the rural versus urban versus small city. If you come to Vancouver next week, I'll be speaking about sense of belonging and being in a big city like Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver versus smaller city like Red Deer, Lethbridge, versus not living in one of those big cities. So like the big difference would be like the CMA, the census metropolitan area, the census agglomerate, and then the rural areas. If you look at the provincial data, I can't remember the Alberta stuff offhand, but in BC, if you are living in Vancouver or Kelowna or Kamloops, that difference in terms of sense of belonging is not statistically significant. The difference that is statistically significant is living in a rural area. And in British Columbia in particular, if you live in a rural area, you feel extremely marginalized. But if you look at the province of BC in particular, immigrants feel left out, period. That's the worst place for feeling like you have a sense of belonging in Canada. So yes, we are looking at that. My report is going to be ready soon. It's in the 500-page range, so I'm crossing the T's and dotting the I's. What I'm doing actually is making sure that my numbers are correct before we release them.
So if I could abuse my position as the chair for a second, the only major study I've ever seen at looking at why newcomers leave was done by StatsCan by Adomamir, I think was his last name. But you can Google it when you go to the StatsCan website, immigration and leaving, and you should be able to find the paper. And typically the answer provided by those that they tracked down was labor market outcomes for the principal applicant. They simply fared better in the country of origin than they did after their experience in Canada. I think Nick might have been being provocative in the numbers that he throws out, as he has a tendency to be, but certainly it's something that we look at, because if we're going to invest in attracting newcomers to Canada, we of course want to invest in making sure they're successful and they stay in Canada. On the urban-rural front, one of the things I should have said about this study that Anna was describing is that's exactly one of our interests. We've heard this as a leitmotif throughout our day so far, of we know that the future includes increasing numbers of newcomers settling outside of Calgary and Edmonton. Which is not to say we're not focused on getting it right in Calgary and Edmonton and building the system of the future in those 2 locales, but it's to say that our vision has to be more complex than it's been in the past, and we must look province-wide in all of those different size communities, not just the major urban centers, which tends to be where it's easier to do research, where it's easier to actually see the scale of the newcomer population and the changes that are necessary. And so we are looking at that forward as well as a major area of interest for the future, because we know we have to find solutions to that. Back to my right, please.
J'ai 2 questions. La première s'adresse à John ou à quelqu'un d'autre de Citoyenneté Migration Canada. Et la seconde aux panélistes. Excusez-moi. La première, j'aimerais savoir si vous pouvez nous donner les études sur lesquelles CIC s'est basé pour faire les réformes dans le système de l'immigration. Puisque j'imagine qu'il y a eu des recherches sur lesquelles ils se sont basés. Ces recherches peuvent nous aider à pouvoir mieux présenter nos prochaines demandes quand vous allez faire l'appel pour les propositions. La seconde s'adresse aux panélistes. Il y a une année depuis qu'on a eu la conférence, presque une année qu'on a eu la conférence nationale, où justement les réformes ont été annoncées. J'aimerais savoir s'il y a eu des recherches que vous avez menées pour essayer de voir, de mesurer un peu les impacts des changements que Citoyenneté et Migration apporte au programme, notamment aux livraisons de services. On parle de l'entrée express, de toutes sortes de choses qui vont arriver bientôt. Quel est l'impact que ces changements vont avoir par rapport à la livraison de services, par rapport à la vie des immigrants? Donc, ces deux côtés, si on peut avoir des recherches qui ont été menées et qui ont guidé à ces changements. Merci.
So while you think about your capacity to have an effective crystal ball, let me answer the first part of that question, but then I'm going to come back to you guys for that. So for the studies that are done internal to the department that have been used to drive the immigration changes, we have an entire division and research and evaluation focused on partnerships, led by one of our colleagues, Xiaoyi Yan. I'd be happy to give you her email address. Real concerted effort to try to get many of the studies that have been completed by the internal research group at CIC translated into both languages and made available on the departmental website. So there are more resources that have gone up there in the not too distant past than you've been able to see in the past. So that's what I would do in the short term. As I go to the website, I'd look at the research papers that are made available there. And in the medium term, I'd ask me for her email address, which I'll give to you, and you can email her directly and ask for them, and those that she can make public, I'm sure she'd be happy to find a way to get to you. Okay? Crystal ball. What are the changes to the immigration system likely to yield in terms of settlement outcomes for newcomers?
I would say the increase in language requirements is going to have a positive effect in terms of we know people who can't speak either of the official languages are having less favorable economic and social outcomes. We know that.
Anybody else want a crystal ball?
I think with express entry, we're seeing an increasing role of employers. And so we've conducted a knowledge synthesis project to try and get a better understanding of what the published literature has to say on the role of employers in bridging newcomers' integration in Canadian labour market, and following that up with a number of studies looking at the role of collaboration and working with employers, what engagement might look like and how that relates to the immigrant settlement sector. But again, it's hard to kind of predict what exactly that impact is going to be as we're waiting to get more information about what this is all going to look like.
I work at a university, so I'm going to use my academic protection here and talk about the elephant in the room. Temporary foreign workers and international students, if you add them together, they eclipse the number of permanent residents coming to Canada. Why should we care? Well, recent studies that I've seen, upwards of 90% of people in both of those categories intend to stay permanently. And guess what? They're not able to access any services. What is that going to mean for people's settlement experiences in the labor market, their feelings of belonging in the community, when their first, taste of Canadian labor market or Canadian society is no, we can't help you because you're not in the right category. Just thought I'd put that out there.
That wasn't a crystal ball, that was a hand grenade. So not to pass the buck, but let me pass the buck. At lunch tomorrow, our former colleague, who is now, I think her title is the Ambassador for Express Entry, Lucille Leblanc, is going to make a presentation on Express Entry. Ask her that question. Typically, in my experience at CIC, when I was in Ottawa living in the policy world, what we would often look at is you would look at the points grid for the economic class, and you would look at the different metrics within it, because all of those have collectible information so that you can run various studies to look at with every increase in a CLB level in English or French, what are the projected economic outcomes following a previous cohort. And that's the tricky part with express entry is as you change the front door, you don't actually fully know what the impact is going to be until that first cohort works its way through the system. So what I would say about research is many of these studies that we've heard today are a benchmark for us. We did not have them before for settlement in Alberta. We did not have them before for settlement anywhere in the country. So we know kind of that snapshot in time for the cohort that had arrived 3 years previously, what those outcomes look like. 3 years into the future, after we see the first landings from all of the changes on the immigration side, if you repeat something reasonably similar, then you can start to tease out what impact those changes are having on the outcomes. There's a lot of supposition, there's been a lot of consultation and a lot of research looking at our best educated, informed, I don't want to call it a guess because I'll get shot and fired, of what those impacts will be. But until you work your first cohort through the system, it's impossible for researchers or policy folks to tell you, will it play out as intended? There's also, of course, those environmental factors, particularly in Alberta. The price of oil has a really big impact on everything that we do. And so if that happens at exactly the same moment, you may also see some really interesting variation across the outcomes of people that arrive at different moments in time in the socioeconomic cycle. Do we have other questions?
Ruth Pryor from the town of Banff FCSS and Settlement Services, Bow Valley. I just wanted to follow up on the comment about the sense of belonging being lower in smaller centres. And I just wanted to ask if there'd been any research more around that, because being from a smaller centre, the information that we get from our clients, some of them face having to move to a larger centre due to affordability issues, and they don't want to go. They love Banff or Camara or Lake Louise, and they feel a very increased belonging. So I was just really interested about the fact that you said that in smaller centres there can be a reduced sense of belonging, because having lived in Calgary and living in the Bow Valley, I would agree that smaller centres can be easier for a sense of belonging and quicker to make connections. So I just wondered if there'd been any, my question is, has there been any more research into that rather than that statistic that you just suggested? Because that's what we hear from our clients, is that people feel very, most of them are feeling a good sense of belonging to it being a smaller community.
So I can't remember what we found for Alberta. I don't think it's as bad as it is for BC, and it might actually be the exact opposite. So I think it's very context driven, and I just ask you to maybe take a look at the report when I get it done, and I'm really sorry that I don't have the Alberta data up in my head. But
if we jump to Vicky, I think the Alberta Settlement Outcome Survey was quite clear.
In Alberta, the rural communities, some of the rural communities actually have a higher sense of belonging. So
this is one of those interesting pieces, and the reason that we invested in the triangulation study of the different outcomes was we wanted to make really certain when we were looking at settlement outcomes that we didn't have any outliers. So where they don't all agree in terms of the outcome, and we cannot explain that by the context or by different variety in the newcomer population and the receiving population, then we're not as confident in those, and we're not as likely to use them in a decision-making process, versus those where the outcomes are the same across every single survey and every single jurisdiction. This gives you a higher level of confidence in terms of moving forward. But as they said, look at the studies. They're really accessible, they're long, but they have great tables of content so you can quickly find the different sections that you're looking for. The experience of the rural communities in the Alberta report were particularly striking when it came out, and I think that those findings are replicated in some of the other surveys. So I would have a look at them if you're in a smaller community and you're interested. Other questions? I think we have time for two more.
Allô. Bonsoir, je m'appelle Mohamed Kourouma. J'ai une question, c'est par rapport à l'affaire de logement. C'est une question qui, comment on appelle ça, qui s'adresse à tous les intervenants depuis ce matin. Depuis qu'on est là, j'ai pas constaté, je n'ai pas écouté aucune intervention par rapport comment on appelle ça, par rapport à la problématique de logement. Donc j'aimerais juste savoir si, soit par rapport aux études que vous avez faites ou bien par rapport aux différents paliers de gouvernement, s'il y a des, comment on appelle ça, s'il y a un travail, un programme qui est fait pour essayer de résoudre le problème de logement pour les nouveaux arrivants, surtout pour les familles nombreuses, parce que c'est un problème criant qui est là présentement dans les grands centres, principalement Edmonton et Calgary. Merci.
Studies about housing. Why don't we start with Vicky this time, and we'll go that way.
Certainly, one of the studies we're starting right now, although it's starting in BC, is looking at housing opportunities for newcomers. But you'll also have noticed maybe in the focus groups that one of the issues that newcomers wanted to get information about before they get here, and I very distinctly remember them talking about this in the focus groups, was, you know, how much are they going to have to pay for housing, for example, when they get here? And can they anticipate that beforehand so they know where to live and what they're going to be able to afford for their families? So it is something that came up in the focus groups, and it is a project that we're now looking at starting in British Columbia, but it will be moving to other places as well. Thank you.
Mamady wants to jump in, and then I'll go to the other end.
En tant que fournisseur de services et en contact direct avec les clients que nous recevons, notre expérience en la matière est que parmi les questions qui nous sont posées pour les gens, par les immigrants qui nous contactent avant même l'arrivée, parmi les questions récurrentes, outre la langue, le logement, je peux dire, vient en première position. Et nous avons des réponses. Ce que nous demandons souvent à nos clients, c'est de leur dire, avant de prendre la décision de s'installer à Calgary ou en tout cas en Alberta, il est très important de prévoir un minimum de ressources, minimum de 6 mois, de pouvoir vivre de façon autonome pendant 6 mois, en tout cas avant de faire le déplacement. Il faudrait qu'ils aient ça en poche avant de faire le déplacement. Et nous leur disons qu'actuellement, le marché de logement est très très cher en Alberta de façon générale et précisément à Calgary pour nous, ce qui nous concerne. Donc nous faisons cette sensibilisation auprès de nos clients, mais aussi quand même il faut reconnaître que nous avons nos contacts au sein de la communauté. D'abord, nous sommes en contact direct avec Calgary Housing. En général, lorsque c'est une famille nombreuse qui arrive et qui a peu de ressources, nous sommes en contact avec Calgary Housing qui facilite et qui accélère leur processus d'accession au logement. Ensuite, nous sommes en contact avec le secteur privé, que ce soit avec les compagnies de logement ou avec les personnes physiques. Nous essayons souvent d'identifier dans la communauté les personnes qui ont des disponibilités en matière de logement. Donc souvent, nous connectons les nouveaux arrivants avec ces gens-là. Et en dernière analyse, pour ceux qui absolument n'ont pas les moyens de se payer le logement et qui n'ont pas les moyens dans les hôtels, nous avons aussi des contacts dans la communauté, en tout cas selon le statut de la personne. Nous essayons vraiment d'accommoder la personne, mais en réalité, la plupart des gens qui viennent, ils sont informés et ils savent vraiment l'état du marché et ils prennent des dispositions pour ne pas rester dehors. Et jamais nous avons toujours fait nos efforts pour ne pas laisser un nouvel arrivant dehors. Ça a été toujours notre effort et nous y parvenons très généralement.
Thank you. Julie, do you have anything you want to add, or Anna or Laurie?
Rick Enns at the University of Calgary has written on this topic, and also Tom Carter at the University of Winnipeg, so you might want to take a look at what they've done.
I just want to add that it's one of the issues is the family size. Many of the newcomer families are big, and what they can afford is a one-bedroom apartment, for example, and so what we need to think about is what kind of housing can be available that is affordable, but also to match the size of the families that are coming.
You've heard the LIPs mentioned over and over and over again, and those that are in British Columbia or in Ontario where there's a fuller set in play, pretty much every single one of them identifies housing as one of the issues that needs to be addressed. And for me, that exemplifies why we're investing in local immigration partnerships, because it is not an area that lies within the mandate of CIC or within our provincial partners. It's a complicated issue, and you have to get the right people table who are the decision makers, whether that's social housing or it's the private sector that builds them or it's co-ops. In order to put the pieces together, you have to have the right decision makers at the table. Other issues are things like transportation that typically come up, and health, where you need a different set of decision makers involved in the mix if you're going to be successful. So that really is one of those reasons that we're focused on that welcoming communities component. I'm super aware of the time. We have a few housekeeping remarks, and we promise to get you out of here a little bit early. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel.